Organized groups of snipers shoot both peaceful protesters and police in Syria, triggering Western intervention. Here, groups of snipers, for no apparent reason, shoot both peaceful protesters and soldiers in Egypt. Unexplained snipers have sparked unrest in Thailand, Venezuela, and many of the other nations not under Washington's control. Organized groups of snipers shoot both peaceful protesters and police in Syria, triggering Western intervention. Here, groups of snipers, for no apparent reason, shoot both peaceful protesters and soldiers in Egypt. Unexplained snipers have sparked unrest in Thailand, Venezuela, and many of the other nations not under Washington's control. Also, Eric Draitser reported on the recent bloodshed in Egypt. Thanks a lot for joining us. Do we see the same thing in Syria?
That's correct. And again, if we examine the same situation in the early days of the Syria conflict, we have many reports from individuals on the ground talking about snipers stationed on the rooftops in cities such as Deraa, Hama, some of the early focal points of the protest movement. Remember that the conflict in Syria emerged out of a protest movement, but that protest movement was not a regime change movement. That was a protest movement and for economic reasons, fuel oil subsidies, perhaps some increased political voice, but it was certainly not a regime change scenario, and it certainly was not a violent civil war from the outset. However, what drove the conflict, what drove the violence in the conflict, were the presence of these snipers in the early days. So when you saw women and children being shot in the head in Deraa or in Hama, and they tried to immediately say that it was Assad's forces who were doing that, conveniently they never provided one piece of evidence to actually demonstrate that. And in fact, even the Arab League observer mission in early 2012, which was openly hostile to the Assad regime, which was clearly an anti-Assad mission, even the Arab League observer mission noted the fact that there was a quote-unquote a third force, a third element inside of Syria that was not the protest movement nor the government of Damascus, and it was some other element, and that element was driving the violence. And of course, as we see now 2 years later, it was incredibly successful in fomenting civil war.
Yeah, why wouldn't forces within the country do this?
It doesn't seem to make sense that either side would really have benefited from this kind of chaos. We need to understand this in this broad narrative of those elements internationally which seek to use violence as a pretext for destabilization. This is no longer the 19th century imperialism that we learn about in history books. You can't just go around invading countries and imposing your will by force and by violence. Rather, it has to be done in a more covert way. And one of the ways that you do that is by creating the necessary humanitarian cover.
Humanitarian cover is now official US policy, revealed in the leaked new US Army manual. Meant to be kept a secret document, the destruction notice reads, "Destroy by any method that will prevent disclosure." The Army manual was released in November 2010, just before snipers began appearing in Syria, designed to get round international outrage at direct invasions like Iraq. The new US Army manual instructs future country takeovers must be predominantly covert. The book lays out how to infiltrate ethnic and religious minorities to provoke civil war. Using snipers against peaceful protesters is an example. Work with guerrilla groups to make them respectable. Arming Al-Qaeda and painting them as victims fits this category. Syria is being bombed, as the report advises. An insider has told RT NATO allies Turkey and Israel are bombing from across the border. In fact, the West's been plotting this invasion of Syria for years. France's ex-foreign minister.
2 years before the violence started, British officials told me they were planning the invasion of Syria.
The Syrian opposition deny these claims.